Claire Marie here, Chris Humphreys. We're going to do just a chat session for our Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act folks here in the Gorge. It's kind of new workshops that we're rolling out. And looks like the easiest way to get this to people is just record the sessions and let you guys view them. So let's see here. Our topic today is going to be just understanding and taking of advantage of neuroplasticity. But before we dive in, like Chris, for the folks that haven't had a chance to connect with you yet, just give a little bit of introduction about yourself, if you would, and what you do with our program.
Yeah, okay, Claire. My name is Chris Humphreys. I am a registered counseling associate with the state of Oregon, qualified mental health professional. For about the last 6 years, I've been a therapist working primarily with first responders. And that includes, I cast a pretty wide net with that definition. That's law enforcement, fire, EMS, dispatch, community corrections, and I'll even put in medical personnel. I did one of the first debriefs for the first COVID death kind of in our region, worked with our ERs through COVID. I'm what you would call really a trauma therapist, trained in a lot of interventions focused around traumatic reprocessing. A lot of buzzwords, in the world right now around that stuff like EMDR, which is eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, all the way to like brain spotting to even I'm trained as a ketamine therapist, just because I've seen what that has done. I come to this career sort of late. I was a law enforcement officer for a couple decades, most of that in the big city, but then I did several terms as a really small town sheriff. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I come at. So.
Awesome. Okay, great. And I think just a little bit of disclaimer for our sessions, right? We're not medical doctors, and what we're wanting to do here is just like provide information to folks, maybe spur some thought. And if you folks want to dive deeper into topics or have questions after you watch the session, Chris is available, as is Steve Bradley. Y'all should have that contact information. If you don't, reach out to me, reach out to leadership within your agency, but Chris and Steve are available to provide mental health support to our folks in the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act grant program for free. And that could be just like, hey, I want to learn more about this topic, right?
Sure. Or if all the way to therapy. I mean, it's a pretty cool program. I provide couples therapy, individual, short, solution-focused, brief therapeutic interventions. Again, what you guys have put together with this program is pretty impressive. That there's no diagnosis required, there's no assessment, like what insurance companies require. I mean, it's just you can call, schedule, and anything from all the way to, like I said, full therapy to just have a cup of coffee and maybe a little education about kind of what's going on.
Yeah, awesome. It's we're excited to offer
even
that.
Pickleball. Didn't you guys have a pickleball tournament under this program?
Yes. We did some yoga, right?
I didn't make that up. I am, that's typical your side of the house.
We did some yoga, which we'll get into, right? Like when we talk about neuroplasticity in the brain and why we plug in programs like yoga, why we plug in things like mindfulness and meditation, and how that ties into mental health and wellness overall, brain health. So as we dive into that topic, I think what's really important is, and as you've mentioned before, we've had a lot of conversations. It's just like, let's start with defining trauma. Because as you've mentioned, that word gets tossed around a lot these days. And obviously trauma is something that is going to be, inherent in the work of law enforcement. And so like, let's talk about that. Help us understand, like, what is trauma really?
Well, yeah. And I don't know if we have time to really dive deep into that conversation other than, I mean, if we're going to talk about neuroplasticity and especially in relation to the populations that we work with, right? Your first responders, your veterans, kind of those high drive types that are out there. you know, we do need to sort of have an agreed, I would say, almost working definition of trauma. And you know, that's I kind of bang this drum where I've seen over the years, right? The word trauma, I think, has been co-opted a little bit to sell books and get on Dr. Phil or whatever, right? And you know, my trauma, my trauma. I mean, we need to understand, right? I mean, trauma, a traumatic incident. I mean, we're designed. In fact, if you look biologically, right, as humans, we're designed, you know, really to experience these dangerous situations, right? And then this amazing thing called the brain is developed to process it and allow us, unlike a lot of other mammals running around, right? We can put it into sort of this long-term storage, right? And so, you know, so we can remember it, but you know, it keeps us alive. I mean, technically, a traumatic incident is a lesson, right? It's something that we learn. You know, now whether or not that becomes traumatizing, right? Meaning it sort of keeps revisiting back upon us, and sort of, you know, kicks in some chemistry and some interesting thought patterns. That really has to do with, you know, the fact that that traumatic incident, which again the brain is designed to experience, right? I mean, and I don't want to get too brain nerdy, but like, right, most everybody's sort of heard of the amygdala, you know, or the lizard brain, right? I mean, something comes up that's threatening or traumatic, right? It kicks in the fight or flight response, and then, you know, the process is that keeps us safe in the moment. It kind of, you know, marks some things, and then eventually we find ourselves safe, you know, and then kind of like the hippocampus or the back portion of the brain sort of modulates for that, right? And eventually, right, when we realize we're safe, the prefrontal cortex, the executive function, comes online, you know, and it starts to really do some higher order processing again. And that puts that into some storage space that we can access on our own. But when that process kind of gets stopped, you know, and that amygdala really just thinks, right, it's holding on to this experience. And that's where you get the stuff like the intrusive flashbacks, or, you know, I mean, even though the fire I was in was 18 years ago, the smell of burning something now when I'm out at a barbecue takes me right back there, and I start sweating and my heart racing, right? That's kind of, you know, for lack of a better term, sort of unprocessed trauma. That's when we call it sort of being traumatizing. Um, in order to really have that discussion again about neuroplasticity, we need to sort of agree what we know about trauma. And that is, one, it's very subjective, right? Meaning it's about the person's own sort of receptors on it, or view on it, or experience. We say like one person's trauma is another person's Tuesday, right? And a lot of that is about based on who we are, how we're living at the time, you know, how we were raised, everything, right, about us kind of builds that filter that makes something, you know, again, one person's trauma being another person's Tuesday. Like, I mean, and I know I can reflect this because I've heard it so many times from my clients, and I also experienced this myself too when I was on the job, right? I could kind of wade through, you know, the horrific stuff. Okay, I mean, it wouldn't, but man, if I walked back in the precinct and I saw an IA complaint in my inbox, bah, you know, that would spin me off of orbit, right? Again, and yet it's just a piece of paper, right? But it's somebody that's claiming I did something. And so trauma is subjective. We also know it's cumulative. And again, this is stuff that we know. There's some amazing researchers in the last like 30 years that have just dove into this. But right, it means that we can be subjected to these traumatic experiences that may not be traumatizing initially, right? But over time, repeated exposure, and it will leave its mark and almost again kind of give that unprocessed portion. And then the other thing we know about trauma, which is again pretty amazing, is those same experiences now can really be measured and really studied. Some of the stuff with the brain, you know, we just call it mapping, but like functional, the fMRI work that like at a Boston University, I think initially, in some of the other areas, and just what we know hormonally now that occurs. You know, so we know that it does actually have a very real physical, effect on the body and the brain. This thing designed, right, to process and experience trauma. Sometimes it can get changed, right, because of these things, the subjectivity and the cumulative nature of that. So, for our populations, and again, when we're talking about sort of neuroplasticity, which is, I know, right, real is kind of the cool term right now. We need to understand that what we're talking about when trauma. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely. So that's a great place to start. And it helps have that foundation, especially for this population, as you said, right? Because that word gets tossed around. So having that in place now, define for us a little bit what is the fancy neuroplasticity word?
well, neuroplasticity, again, I mean, it just means that these changes that occur, and again, this is specific to our population, right? And when we're talking about providing supports to them or wellness or resiliency, again, it's that, again, sometimes these effects of repeated exposure to trauma or even one singular overwhelming event will change certain aspects of the brain, and again, what is physical appearances of a connection, understand, right, that's actually can be a human thought, right, that's being driven within the brain. And so again, that's where we'll sometimes see what we assume is fixed thinking patterns, when somebody has a traumatic experience and it literally may blunt off some connections in the brain, right, we'll start to see parts of the brain get smaller, amygdala gets larger, those sorts of things. And what you would think is fixed, then we actually know it's not true. The brain, again, is this amazing organ. It can um, it can either regrow. It can, the one I think is amazing, because again, I work in ketamine and some of those other areas. We'll see that certain dendritic connections will start to go around and rebuild. And again, when you understand those physical appearances actually equate to some changing in thought patterns and cognitions, it's pretty profound that we can do that, right? And I see that every day in therapy, working with, that's a cop that works in and walks in and says, I can't take this anymore, I'm broken, for whatever reason, right? And I need to give up this job that I love, and I'm broken. And we'll do certain things, certain interventions, and I mean, this very fixed thought pattern goes poof. They continue to work. Sometimes even, and this is what we shoot for, that cool thing. And I know that's not what today's about, but that I preach and that I'm just an absolute believer in, but what we call post-traumatic growth, right? And that's evidence of neuroplasticity. To take something that is this horrific experience and gain meaning out of it and operate maybe sometimes a little differently and operate in a way that is more beneficial, right? That's a tough conversation to have, but that's an element of neuroplasticity, right? Rewiring your brain, essentially. Sorry, that was a long-winded
Oh, that's awesome. That's
definition.
awesome. So,
So
okay. So we know trauma is going to happen in the work of law enforcement. We know that it has cumulative effects. We know that the brain can change in different ways, but it's not fixed, right? So we can actually change the structures, the function within the brain. That happens naturally. There's ways that we can work on that intentionally. So when it comes to working in law enforcement, just understanding what the brain can do, help folks understand, what does it look like to utilize this to their advantage, right? So maybe talk a little bit about self-soothing, self-care, how that plays, into
you
this.
said the self-care word. I laugh because I've been speaking about this for a few years now, and there's a group of, especially in Oregon, I'm honored to work around and with. I mean, there's a lot of really good, culturally competent first responder clinicians, right? And sometimes we get together and we chuckle because you use the word self-care, especially to our public servant types, right? And they recoil, because they hear the word self and immediately they think selfish, right? Right. I mean, I can't take care of myself, and it makes sense, right? I mean, these are people that I mean, I missed five of 5 years of my daughter's birthdays, putting myself at risk for complete strangers, right? So if you're asking me to care for myself, I mean, that's the last thing I'm going to think about. But really, neuroplasticity, and especially again, into this conversation, we plug it into, or we should be plugging it into the resiliency model. That's the thing everybody's preaching, right? I mean, even the police academy, right? They got the resiliency programs and all of that, and it's beautiful. But um, you know, neuroplasticity is a part of that. And what we know, what really works well, is if we look at it like, right, remember, we're going to see these experiences. You're going to have traumatic experiences. How do we keep them from being traumatizing? Well, look at it as a preparation and then a recovery phase, right? Um, right. So if we can keep the brain malleable prior to, right, again, it's not so fixed. It will recover quicker, right? And so the malleable portion, the preparation portion, everybody's really into right now, and that's the wellness discussions. And that's awesome. And man, there's a million podcasts and a million people eat right, sleep right, go meditate in nature and stare at your belly. And that's awesome. And I don't think we need to beat that one up. But we do know, and I think the conversation needs to be had on the other side, is there's going to be times when wellness doesn't work, right? There's going to be times when we are going to have stuff that just knocks us on our keister. And how do we get back up, right? Well, how do we get back up and what's that going to look like? And that again is that neuroplasticity. And that is that recovery portion of resilience. And that's where, again, you get to the issue of and there's a lot of people that are using kind of two different terms there. And this is for the recovery portion, which is self-soothing, right? Or, coping mechanisms, but it's really self-soothing, because what happens with the body is you have the traumatic experience, right? And we need that, again, that brain to regulate towards safety. So again, self-soothing is about building in safety, and self-soothing activities look like those ones that sometimes, as a clinician, when I'm preaching it, other clinicians like, oh, don't tell them to do that. But it's the nice big fat burger on the couch. I'm not moving, right? I'm just staring at Netflix. I'm just home. I just need to turn it all out, right? That's a self-soothing. Self-soothing activities don't require a lot of motion, to be honest. I mean, alcohol use is self-soothing. Again, right? I'm not promoting it, but I'm also not denigrating it. It works until it doesn't work, right? That self-soothing stuff engenders a sense of safety, and really, that's the body. The body, again, that amygdala, it needs to know it's safe, right? And the issue, again, a problem with self-soothing, right, is we can do it a little too long, right, when it becomes the thing. And that's where, again, our social connections help us when we need to have those people in our life that are pointing out, Humphreys, you're on the couch too much. But then there's the next step, and that's when, you've soothed, you got to that sense of safety, in order to kind of, again, assist in that recovery, that neuroplasticity. If you really want to start building new connections, that moves into the different area of what we call discomfort. So again, the get to the sense of safety is really comfort, right? My couch, my big fat burger, a beer, and Netflix, for half a day to just chill out and get back to where I know, right, I'm not going to get shot or killed. That's one thing. But to turn that horrific event that I experienced into something, right, again, that I can use even, or that I can recall, and it doesn't make me freak out, that requires me to get the brain online, and the brain requires discomfort, right? And that's where we talk about self-care. And again, people have conflated self-care with like, do things that make you happy. Sure. But actually, it comes down a little bit more basic to that. And again, there's a lot of podcasts and a lot of doctors that are really talking about this very intelligently, much better than me. But I look at it with my clients and the people I work with is, self-care, that recovery phrase, that little bit of discomfort, maybe a big bit of discomfort, to help you rewire your brain to process these experiences. It requires intentionality, Self-care requires intentionality, meaning you're actually choosing to do it, right? It's yes, I would much rather sit here on the couch and maybe, play with my dog or something, but no, I'm choosing to be intentional and go to the gym, right? In fact, I put it on my books. This is when I go to the gym, right? So I'm making a choice. It requires some effort. Now, again, that's movement, and I use this when I all the time. But again, I'll go back to sort of like, let's say, going to the gym, right? It requires me to grab my gym bag, get in my car, drive the 10 minutes. I'd rather just stay home and right. So intentionality, effort, and then it's got to provide some sort of level of I use the word reward, but it could be gain or skill or effort rewarded, right? And I mean, again, going back to the physical stuff you talked about, yoga, right? I mean, that as a process of neuroplasticity, right? If I work hard at it, I generally can see some sort of gain, um, about it, and that's that self-soothing to self-care in that recovery piece. And again, it's that important portion of sort of neuroplasticity, again, and we're causing the brain to be a little uncomfortable, right? And discomfort helps to encourage growth.
Mhm.
Now that's the Chris Humphreys real basic definition. Much smarter people than me, but what we're seeing successfully out there is if we kind of go with that route.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So I know we only have a couple minutes left of your time. So I know it's a buzzword. But can you help folks understand, because we do have an aspect of the program that does focus on promoting and offering yoga, mindfulness meditation practices, just from a neuroplasticity standpoint, and the pathways that we're building in the brain. What are the potential benefits, or what are you mastering or working to master when you're doing those kinds of practices?
Now, you know how uncomfortable it is to take a night shift street cop. Let's just go that route. You could insert any first responder in there. And to literally say to them, pause, don't think about the past, right? Which is right. That's our training. Oh, we're trained, right? Always. I mean, what do we know? What do we know? What do we know? And don't think about the future, right? What could happen, right? And I mean, again, the literal emergency response responder, the first responder, that's how they live moment to moment, right? Hot call pops on your box. You're immediately thinking about what could be, and you're also thinking about what has been, right? And trying to meet those two up, right? Now let me take you and say, whoa, take a breath and just be in the moment. How uncomfortable do you think that makes their brain?
So uncomfortable.
Oh my gosh. And in fact, that's why it's so funny. I mean, there's some neat little things out like what's like biofeedback for, they call it the M wave. I use it now and again. And you put it on the ear and it measures, the heart rate variability, but essentially it's right. Breathe in time with your heart.
Mhm.
And it's got it used to be a expensive machine you had to buy, but of course everything now it's an app on your phone, right? And I can get every first responder in the world to do that because right, it's biofeedback. It's like a game. They want to get the green light to be in. But if I were to say to them, hey, just sit there, focus on your breathing for a bit without hooking that up in the game, they're gonna, Humphreys in meditation. But right, what are they doing? Right. And it's and again, that's that right. And I mean, learning a new skill, we'll tell you. I mean, I've been through several pretty high profile critical incidents sort of things. And it's interesting. I look back now as a guy that's got 2 master's degrees, way too many certifications. And most of those started because I was in the middle of something. And I thankfully had several good mentors. And at one time, one good therapist. And actually good leaders. Good leaders should know when to nudge your people into that sort of, as we say, self-recovery or self-care. Get off the couch. My getting off the couch was like an idiot. I enrolled in a master's program. I mean, right. And I mean, at the same time, that my name is blasted in all the papers and all of these things, and again, it's sort of like that. So learning new skills, the mindfulness, I mean, yeah, put me in a unitard and make me do yoga. I mean, that's really going to put me in a zone of discomfort. Yeah. So
Unitard is required actually for the yoga.
Well,
It's
well,
not. I'm
I'm
kidding.
telling you, that is not going to be
It's
recorded.
not
So
required, I
guys,
swear.
at least,
Come to yoga,
yeah,
everybody.
yeah, yeah.
Unitard not required. Yeah, no, that's amazing. So, we'll get into, I think in a future session, we can even just talk about we'll definitely in a future session talk about attention and the role of meditation in being aware of and managing and training our attention and that influence of that in the experience of life that we have both in the work world and in the personal world. But
Well, it's that skills building, right? I mean, again, that skill building, building intentionality or attention in the moment. What am I seeing? I mean, yeah. And what's amazing is then you can translate that into in the moment, right? Especially when you're talking about anxiety responses. We do that a lot. And we find that to be very, very effective in helping people sort of manage that anxiety. Right?
I
Yeah,
believe it.
good
So
stuff.
thank you so much for your time today. And we'll get this out to folks and we'll connect again in a few weeks.